Chapter 8, Part 1, 2, and 3 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 8, Parts 1, 2, and 3. The Foundation of the Athenian Empire. Section 1. The Position of Sparta and Career of Pausanias. The Persian War, in its effects on Greece, illustrates the operation of a general law which governs human societies. Pressure from without, whether on a nation or a race, tends to promote unity and cohesion within. In the case of a nation, the danger of foreign attack increases the sense of unity among individual citizens and strengthens the central power. In the case of a race, it tends to weld the individual communities into a nation or a federation. In the latter case, the chance of realizing a complete or permanent unity depends partly on the strength and the duration of the external pressure, partly upon the degree of strength in the instinct for independence which has hitherto hindered the political atoms from cohesion. The Persian danger produced a marked tendency towards unity, but the pressure was acute only for a few years, and lasted in any form only for a few decades, and therefore that tendency was arrested, and the instinct for independence resumed its uncontested sway, before any scheme of pan-Hellenic federal government had become necessary. On the coast of Asia, where the danger was permanent, an union came into existence. Now on these principles a philosopher might have predicted that an Hellenic union, whether whole or partial, whether of short or of long duration, would follow the repulse of the Persians. He might have predicted that such a great joint effort would react upon the domestic development of the victorious peoples. But no one could have foreseen what the shape of the union would take, or how the reaction would be directed. The course of Grecian affairs entered upon a new and unexpected way. For the last 40 years Sparta had been the predominant power in continental Greece. She had become the head of a Peloponnesian League, and had intervened with effect in Greek affairs beyond the limits of the Peloponnesus. Her headship in the common resistance to Persia was recognized without murmur or dispute by the allies of northern Greece. In fact, her peninsular league may be said to have widened into the Pan-Hellenic Confederacy of the Isthmus. Her admirals had been commanders-in-chief at Salamis and at Mycale, and, if it were said that those naval victories could not be ascribed to Lacedaemonian skill or enterprise, Sparta could point to Thermopylae, where her king had been gloriously defeated, to Cytharion, where her general and her spearsmen had won what was, after all, the decisive contest of the war. A political prophet would therefore have been tempted to predict that Sparta, universally acknowledged before the war to be the leading state of Greece, would after the war be able to convert leadership into dominion. A great national enterprise, conducted under her auspices to a splendid conclusion, must immensely increase the moral strength of her position, and might justly stimulate her ambition. Moral power, by dexterous management, can soon be converted into material strength. In short, after the battle of Platae, the Greek world seemed to lie at Sparta's feet. If such calculations were made, they were doomed to disappointment. Lacedaemon had not the means, and the Lacedaemonian government had not the brains or the spirit to create the means, of carrying out an effective imperial policy. For a state which aspired to a truly imperial position in Greece must inevitably be a sea power. This was determined by the geographical and commercial conditions of the Greek world. So long as the Asian Greeks belonged to the Persian dominion, so long as the eastern waters of the Aegean were regarded as a Persian sea, Sparta might indeed hold a dominant position as a Hellas thus restricted. But when the world of free Hellenic states once more extended over the Aegean Sea to the skirts of Asia and to Thrace, Sparta, unless she became a sea power, could not extend her influence over this larger sea-bound Greece. She might retain her continental position, but her prestige must ultimately be eclipsed and her power menaced by any city which won imperial authority over the islands and coasts of the Aegean. This was what happened. The Spartans were a people unable to adapt themselves to new conditions. Their city, their constitution, their spirit were survivals from medieval Greece. The government was conservative, by tradition, reforms were unwelcome, a man of exceptional ability was regarded with suspicion. They continued to drill their hoplites in the 5th century as they had done in the 6th. The formation of a navy would have seemed to them as unpractical an idea as an expedition against the capital of Persia. And if we follow their conduct of the recent war, we see that their policy was petty and provincial. They had generally acted at the last moment. They had never shown the power of initiation. Their view was so limited by the smaller interests of the Peloponnesus that again and again they almost betrayed the national cause. Failing to share in the progress of Greece, utterly wanting in the imperial instinct and the quality of imagination which accompanies it, the city of Lacedaemon was not marked out to achieve a political union of the Hellenic states. She was, however, able to prevent a rival from achieving it, but not before that rival had completely thrown her into the shade. Unfortunately, the events of the years succeeding the battle of Platae are but very slightly known. Herodotus, who, about half a century later, completed the story, compact of fiction and history, of the Persian War, ends his work at the capture of Sestos. In the meantime, the events of that full and momentous half-century had not been recorded, except by bits and scraps. The dates became confused, the details were forgiven, and when Thucydides, some years after Herodotus, came to investigate the history of this period, the result of his research was a meagre narrative, in a very uncertain chronological setting. The growth of the Athenian Empire is the central fact of the period. But, before tracing it, we must pause, it will not be for long, over the misfortunes of Sparta. Pausanias, the son of Cleombrotus, had shown, it must be allowed, remarkable military ability in conducting the campaign of Platae. But his talents as a politician were not equal to his talents as a general. Leaping into fame by his victory, he was led into attempting to play a part for which he was too slight a man. Sparta sent him out, in command of a squadron of ships supplied by her allies, to continue the work of emancipating the Eastern Greeks. He sailed first to Cyprus, and was successful in delivering the greater part of the island from Persian rule. He then proceeded to Byzantium and expelled the Persian garrison. But here his conduct became ambiguous. He began to play a game of his own. He connived at the escape of some kinsmen of Xerxes who were in the city, and he committed various acts of insolence and oppression to the Greeks. He behaved more as a tyrant than as a general, and he completely ruined all chances that his country had of remaining at the head of the confederacy which the Persian invasion had called into being. The Eastern Greeks placed themselves under the protection and headship of Athens. This step was inevitable. The maritime power of Athens marked her out to be a leader in the prosecution of the war beyond the sea. But the conduct of Pausanias at Byzantium may well have been the occasion of the formal transference of the leadership of the confederacy from Sparta to Athens. At Sparta itself, the reports of the doings of the general aroused alarm and anxiety. He was recalled to answer the charges. It was said that he wore Persian dress, and was attended by an Asiatic bodyguard in his journey through Thrace. For he had indeed been intriguing with the Persian court. The victor of Platae offered to enslave his own city and the rest of Hellas to Xerxes, and to seal the compact by marrying his daughter. His overtures were welcomed by the great king, and Pausanias, being a small man and elated by vanity, was unable to refrain from betraying in little things his treacherous designs. The Persian intrigue, however, could not at this time be proved against him. He was punished only for some acts of injury which he had done to particular persons. He was not sent out again, but he subsequently hired a trireme for himself, and returned to the scene of his former intrigue. He resumed possession of Byzantium, and thus controlled the inner gate of the Euxine, and he succeeded almost immediately in capturing Sestos, which gave him control of the outer gate also. This was too much for Athenians who were extending their political and commercial interests in these regions, and they sent out a squadron under Cimon, the son of Miltiades, who recovered Sestos and drove Pausanias out of Byzantium. Spartan government, hearing that he was intriguing in the Troad, sent a herald commanding him to return home. He obeyed the summons, believing that he could compass an acquittal by bribes, but it seems that he was already devising a daring and dangerous plan against the constitution of his own city. The ephors threw him into prison, but it was difficult to procure evidence of his guilt. He was released and challenged inquiry. Everybody knew that he had not only negotiated with Persia, but that he had prepared the way for a revolt of the Helots by promising them emancipation. He dreamed of converting the Spartan state into a true monarchy. But there were not clear enough proofs to act upon, until a confidential servant turned informer. Pausanias had entrusted him with a letter to Artabazus, but the man, who had noticed that none of the messengers who had been previously dispatched on the same errand ever returned, broke the seal and read in the letter the order for his death. He showed the letter to the ephors, and they, wishing to have proof against Pausanias from his own mouth, contrived a stratagem. A hut with a partition was erected at the sanctuary of Taenarus. They concealed themselves in one room, and the man remained in the other as suppliant. Pausanias came to discover why he was there. The man told him of the letter and reproached him. In the conversation, Pausanias admitted the whole truth. But he received a hint of his danger, and fled to the temple of Athena of the Brazen House. He took refuge in a small covered building adjoining the shrine. The ephors had the doors built up and starved him to death. As he was dying, they brought him out, and by the command of the Delphic god he was buried at the entrance to the sacred enclosure. But the starvation within the precincts was an offense against the goddess, and brought a curse upon the Spartans. To expiate this, they dedicated 2 brazen statues to Athena of the Brazen House. Though the adventures of Pausanias are of no great consequence, his career is typical of the Spartan abroad, and it throws some light on years of which we know very little. The Spartan government had sent out another general to replace Pausanias in the Hellespont, but the allies would have no more dealings with Spartan generals, and Sparta made no further attempt to win back the allegiance which the Aegean and Asiatic Greeks had transferred to Athens. On the other hand, she made some attempts at extending her power on the mainland, and forming a continental federation. She cast her eyes upon Thessaly, and perhaps hoped that if she brought the far north under her sway, she could extend her influence southward to the Thracian Gulf, and form a Lacedaemonian empire on the basis of the Amphictyon League of northern Greece. She sent forth an army under King Leotychidas, who landed in the Pagasean Bay, and showed that he could have easily subjugated the Thessalonian states. But like many a Spartan general, he could not resist silver and gold, and the Aleuid princes saved their power by bribing the invader. His guilt was evident, and when he returned home he was condemned to death. He saved himself by fleeing to Tegea, where Athena's sanctuary was ever the refuge of a Spartan king in the day of danger. It is possible that Sparta gained some influence in Thessaly by this enterprise, in which she employed the Peloponnesian fleet, but she made no conquest. Nor did her attempt to reorganize the Amphictyonic federation prosper better. She proposed to expel from this league all the states that had joined the Mede. This was aimed at Thebes and Thessaly, and even the states which had not joined the federation against the Mede. This was aimed at Argos. But through the influence of Themistocles, who represented Athens, the proposal was thrown out. The activity of Themistocles in defeating the designs of Sparta at this period is reflected in the story that he tried to induce the Athenians to set fire to the Peloponnesian fleet in Thessalian waters. Sparta was unable to prosecute any further plans of empire beyond her own peninsula. She was soon compelled to fight for her position within the Peloponnesus itself. Argos had now recovered somewhat from the annihilating blow which had been dealt her by King Cleomenes, and was entering upon a new constitutional development which was ultimately to shape itself into a democracy. Most of the small towns, which had taken advantage of the prostration of their mistress to throw off her yoke, such as Hysiae and Orniae, were brought back again to their allegiance. It might have been harder to cast out the slave lords Tyrrhens from their Cleopian fortress, But a prophet from Phiglia came and stirred them up against Argos. They took the offensive, endured a defeat, and Tiryns was recovered. Thus re-arising, Argos was able to support the Arcadian cities in a combination against the power of Sparta. She entered into alliance with Tegea, but outside the walls of that city the joint forces of the two allies were smitten by the hoplites of Lacedaemon. Yet the city was not taken, and the epitaph of the fallen warriors told how their bravery hindered the smoke of blazing Tegea from their mountain to the sky. Soon after this we find all the Arcadian cities leagued against Sparta, all except the Mantineans, who were never ready to join hands with their Tegeate neighbors. This time Argos sent no help. The Arcadian League sustained a crushing defeat at Dipaea, and Tegea was forced to submit. Thus, through the energy of the young king Archidamus, Sparta maintained her position. But there were grave causes of anxiety for the future. She had to behold the cynicism of the villages of Elis into a city with a democratic constitution. That was a danger in the west. Regenerate Argos was a danger in the east. And even in Arcadia, Sparta was constrained reluctantly to recognize the new cynicism of the Mantinean villages as a mark of gratitude to the community for holding aloof from the Arcadian League. Thus it was not given to Sparta to strike out a new path. The Persian War left her much where she was before. She had, if anything, diminished rather than increased her prestige, and she had shown the world that she was destined to remain in the old Peloponnesian groove. In the meantime another city had been advancing with rapid strides along a new path, compassing large enterprises and establishing a large empire. The lukewarmness of Sparta, exhibited in her failure to follow up the battle of Mycale, had induced the Ionian and other Asiatic Greeks to place themselves under the leadership of Athens. Thus was formed the voluntary confederacy on which an Athenian empire was to rise. The object was not only to protect the rescued cities from reconquest by the barbarian, but also to devastate the country of the great king, in order to obtain by rapine a set-off against the expenses and losses of the war. The treasury of the League was established in the sacred island of Delos, the ancient centre of Ionian worship, and it was hence called the Confederacy of Delos. The recapture of Sestos was its first achievement. The League included the Ionian and Aeolian cities of Asia, the islands adjacent to the coast from Lesbos to Rhodes, a large number of towns on the Propontis, and some in Thrace, most of the Cyclades, and Euboea, except its southern city, Carystus. It was a league of sea-states, and therefore the basis of the contract was that each state should furnish ships to the common fleet. But most of the members were small and poor. Many could not equip more than 1 or 2 ships. Many could do no more than contribute a part of the expenses to the furnishing of a single galley. To gather together a number of small and scattered contingents at a fixed time and place was always a matter of difficulty, nor was such a miscellaneous armament easily managed. It was therefore arranged that the smaller states, instead of furnishing ships, should pay a yearly sum of money to a common treasury. It is uncertain how the amount of these payments was fixed. It seems probable that a calculation was made that all the states, which undertook to pay in money, ought to have been able to contribute between them 100 ships, and that the annual sum of 460 talents was taken as the equivalent of this contribution. Then a careful estimate was made of the resources and capacities of each city, and that sum was proportionately distributed among them. The valuation of the wealth of the confederate cities and the determination of the contribution of each was a work of great difficulty and responsibility, and it was devolved upon Aristides, whose discretion and the respect in which he was held fitted him eminently for the task. His valuation remained in force for more than 50 years. Thus from the very beginning the confederacy consisted of 2 kinds of members: those who furnished ships and those who paid an equivalent in money, a pharos, as it was called, and the second class was far the larger. For besides those who could only furnish a ship or 2, or even part of a ship, many of the larger cities preferred the system of payments, which did not oblige their burghers to leave home. The tribute was collected by 10 Athenian officers who bore the title of Hellenotame, the treasurers of the Greeks. The council of the confederates met at Delos, where the treasury was, and each member had an equal voice. The large number of votes enabled Athens easily to control the proceedings of the council. She would influence the smaller states, and the number of these votes overcame the weight of any opposition which the larger states could offer. As leader of the confederacy, Athens had the executive entirely in her hands, and it was of the highest significance that the treasurers were not selected from the whole body of confederates, but were Athenian citizens. Thus, from the first, Athens held in her hands the means of gradually, and without any violent revolution, transforming the naval union into a naval empire. While the name of Aristides is connected most closely with the foundation of the Confederacy, there is no doubt that it was due to its rival Themistocles that Athens took the tide of fortune at the flood. Themistocles had made his city a sea power, and this feat proved him the greatest of statesmen. He was a man of genius. The most reserved of all historians, Thucydides, turns aside to praise his unusual natural gifts, his power of divining what was likely to happen, and his capacity for dealing with difficult situations. We should have expected that the guidance of the policy of Athens, the organization of the new confederacy, would have been entirely entrusted to Themistocles. Half a century later, when the democratic development of Athens had advanced farther, this would probably have been the case. But at this time a man without powerful connections could not long maintain his influence over the people. Themistocles had no party behind him, and the exceptional ability of the man is shown by nothing so much as by the fact that, in spite of this disadvantage, he played such a great part. His rivals, Aristides and Xanthippus, were representative of the old and considerable party of the coast, which was associated with the family of Megacles and Cleisthenes, to which the wife of Xanthippus belonged. They are the leaders at Platae and Mycale. The name of Themistocles does not appear in the second year of the Persian War. The circumstance that Themistocles was not a party leader, that there was no protracted period during which Athens submitted to his influence, might easily lead us to underrate his importance. Though he was not formally or officially the founder of the Confederacy, yet when Athens undertook the leadership and entered upon the new paths which then opened out before her, she was under the spell of a spirit which he had been the clearest and earliest interpreter. But his influence had not yet passed away, and while the fleet was building an empire in the east, there was work for him to do amid the ruins of Athens. The fortification of Athens and the Piraeus. Themistocles, as we saw, made Athens a sea power. Under his guidance she threw her chief energy into the development of a navy, but if she had followed that guidance more fully, she would now have cut herself more boldly adrift from the ties which attached her to the continent. It often occurred to the Athenians to regret that Athens was not an island. If we were islanders, they thought, we could defy the world. There would always be the Boeotian and the Megarian frontiers. But if a series of strong fortresses had been regularly maintained on those frontiers, and if Athenian politicians had resolutely eschewed a continental policy, it might have been possible to spend practically all their strength on their ships. In any case, when Athens decided to enter upon a new career, her true policy would have been to come down to the Piraeus. She should have left her old city round the Acropolis and migrated to the shore of the sea, which was henceforward to shape her history. The position of the Acropolis was a fatality for Athens. It was too far from the sea, and at the same time too near. If it had been as far from the coast as Acharnae, the citizens would almost certainly at this period have transferred their hearths and temples to the hill of Munichia and the shores of the Piraeus. But it was near enough to admit of tolerably quick communication with the harbor, and this geographical circumstance at once saved the old town and weakened the new city. Expediency will induce a monarch, but nothing except necessity will persuade a free people to take the monumentous resolution of leaving the spot where the homes and temples of the community have stood for centuries, the place associated with their dearest memories, their hopes, and their fears. Had Themistocles been a tyrant, we may venture to suppose that he would have left Athens unfortified, built his palace on Munichia, and made Piraeus the center of government, the city, so that in a few years the old town would have sunk into decay. But since Athens was to remain as before, notwithstanding the new development, and since this new development made the Piraeus of greater strategic importance, it became necessary to fortify and defend two towns within 5 miles distance of each other. After Plataea, the Athenians brought back their families and goods to their desolate habitation. Little of the old town wall was still standing, and they proceeded to build a new wall. The work was done in haste. The material of older buildings and even gravestones was used. The traces of haste can be detected in some of the remains of this wall of Themistocles, near the Dipylon Gate, in the northwest of the city. For it was by the advice and under the inspiration of Themistocles that the work was wrought. It embraced a larger circuit than the old enclosure which Pisistrates had destroyed. On the south side it followed the heights of the Phoenix group of hills, and approached the Ilissus. The Peloponnesians looked with jealousy at the rise of the Athenian walls. The activity of Athens in the Persian War and her strong navy made them suspect her ambitions. But they could not prevent her from strengthening her town. The Lacedaemonians sent an embassy to deprecate fortifications, and to invite the Athenians, instead of fortifying their own town, to join Sparta in demolishing all fortifications in Greece. But they were not in a position to do more than remonstrate. As the name of Themistocles was associated with the wall, it was inevitable that an anecdote should be circulated to illustrate the resources and wiles of the Attic Odysseus. At his suggestion, the Spartan envoys were sent back with the answer that the Athenians would send an embassy. When they were gone, he started himself as one of the ambassadors, but his colleagues were to remain behind till the wall had reached the lowest defensible height. In the meantime, the whole population, men, women, and children, were to press on the work. Having arrived at Sparta, he delayed presenting himself before the assembly, and when he was asked why, he said that his colleagues had been detained, and that he expected them every day. Meanwhile, persons arriving from Athens assured the Spartans that the wall was being built. Themistocles asked them not to be deceived by such rumors, but to send men of their own to discover whether it was true. At the same time he sent a message to Athens with instructions that the envoys from Sparta should be detained till he and his colleagues had returned. The wall had now reached a sufficient height, and the other ambassadors having arrived, Themistocles appeared before the assembly, and declared that Athens had walls and could defend any communication to make. They must deal with us as with men who are capable of deciding their own and Greece's interests. The Lacedaemonians had to put as good a face on the matter as they could. The story has significance in representing Athens as now formally declaring herself the peer of Sparta. The fortification of Piraeus was likewise taken in hand. A thick wall was built all around the Munichian peninsula, keeping close to the sea, and was continued along the north side of the harbour of Catharos, or the harbour as it was simply called, and out to the promontory of Aetonia. The entrances to this chief harbour and to the two small havens of Munichia and Zea on the east side of the peninsula were fortified by moles. In the course of the next 20 years the Athenians came to see the disadvantage of the two towns, which ought to have been won. It was borne in upon their statesmen that in the case of an enemy invading Attica with a powerful army, the communications between Athens and the Piraeus might be completely severed, and the folk of the city be cut off from their ships. In order to meet this danger, which would have been most simply met by deserting Athens, a new device was imagined. It was resolved to transform the two towns into a double town, girt by a continuous line of fortification. Two diverging walls were built to connect Athens with the sea. The northern joined the Piraeus wall, near the harbour, the southern ran down to the roadstead of Phalereon. By these long walls, costly to build and costly to defend, Athens sought to rectify a mistake and adapt her topography to her role of mistress of the sea. But though this device of Athens to conciliate her past history with her future seems clumsy enough, it answered its purpose fairly well. Her naval power was based upon the only sure foundation, a growing naval commerce. This in its turn depended upon the increase of Attic industries, which may be estimated by the enormous number of resident aliens or metics, who settled in Athens or Piraeus for the purpose of manufacture and trade. These metics, who seem to have ultimately approached the number of 10,000, were liable to the same ordinary burdens as the citizens, and when a property tax was imposed in time of war, they were taxed at a higher rate. We may well believe that Themistocles was concerned to encourage the growth of a class of inhabitants who were directly or indirectly so profitable to the community. But in our scanty and vague records of this momentous period, it is impossible to define the activity of Themistocles. We know that he wished to introduce a system by which a certain number of triremes should be added every year, but this idea was not adopted. New ships were built from time to time according as they were needed, but a new system of furnishing them was introduced. The state supplied only the hull and some of the rigging. The duty and expense of fitting the galley, launching it complete, and training the oarsmen, were laid upon the most wealthy burghers, each in his turn. This public burden was called the trierarchy, and the trierarch, who sailed with his ship, was responsible for the good repair of the trireme at the end of the period of his office. 170 oarsmen, composed of hired foreigners and slaves, and partly of the poorest class of the citizens, propelled each galley. There was a crew of 20 men to manage the vessel, including the calustas, who set the time to the oarsmen, and there were, besides, 10 soldiers. As their navy was from henceforth to be the chief arm of their military power, the Athenians were obliged to make a necessary change in the constitution of their highest military command. 2 courses were open to them. They might leave the board of generals as it was, each general being the captain of the hoplites of his own tribe, and institute a new board of admirals. If this arrangement had been made, it would have been necessary to assign to the admirals a higher authority, for the purpose of conducting joint operations by land and sea, so that the position of generals would have been reduced to that of subordinate officers. The other course was, to make the generals supreme commanders, by land and sea alike, and such had been their virtual position during the Persian invasion. This second plan was adopted, and as a logical consequence the generals were no longer elected one from each tribe, but from the whole people, though in actual practice an attempt was made to secure that each tribe should be represented. The old duties of the generals as commanders of the tribal regiments were undertaken for the infantry by new officers, called taxiarchs, and for the cavalry by the phylarchs. The fortification of the city and her harbour was the chief, but it was not the only, work that the masons of Athens were set to do. The Persians had wrecked the houses of Athena on her high hill, and no duty was more pressing for the Athenians, when the danger passed, than to find a dwelling place for the goddess. There can be little doubt that their first thought was to restore the elder temple, the house which she shared with Erechtheus, the place of the precious emblems of the olive tree and the salt spring, if it were only to make it ready in some temporary fashion to receive the ancient wooden image, which had probably been lodged in a secret hiding place. It is not clear that they attempted any complete or partial restoration of the younger temple, the house of 100 feet. Perhaps they simply swept away the ruins. Probably the walls and columns still partly stood, but the roof and all the woodwork had been destroyed, and the sculptures which adorned the pediments had been cast down and shattered. The limbs and trunks of the giants, strewn among the ruins, were cast away into the rubbish heaps, from which they have now been drawn forth recently into new honour, as precious relics of the early art of Greece. In any case, even if they rebuilt in some sort the dismantled temple, the burghers of Athens were not content. They resolved that the lady of their city should have an ampler and more glorious dwelling-house. It was probably when Themistocles was still their guiding statesman that the plan was laid of a second temple near the southern brink of the hill. The foundations of this new temple are still to be seen, but it was never carried out as it was designed. When the time came to rear the walls, the plan was entirely altered, and, as we shall see hereafter, the Parthenon arose on the foundations which were intended for a building of wholly different proportions. Chapter 8.